Chris, thank you for hopping on the podcast.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
So, I would love to kind of dive in. I know you're studying history. What type of history do you study, and what fascinates you about the subject?
Yeah, so I'm studying for my undergrad in history at the moment. It's a general history degree, so it doesn't specialize in anything. It's very very broad to be fair, but my personal kind of passion point in history is medieval Europe.
Mm.
It's always been that way since I was a kid, but unfortunately, my university degree doesn't actually cover that period at all.
Mm.
But I keep telling myself that it's filling in all the other gaps around, so it's definitely going to be worth it.
It's interesting because it sounds like you will have to kind of do some self-study on your end to study, that era that you're so interested in. And so, when you kind of think about, the medieval time, are there any lessons from the medieval time that you feel like we can learn from today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And realistically, a historian called Matt Lewis, a great historian, says everything is medieval, and he kind
Mm.
of says it as a bit of a half joke, but it really is the case. I think you can look back at any period of history and like you said, learn lessons from X, Y, and Z. And this is when people ask me, oh, why do you like history? Why do you like medieval history specifically? And ultimately it's great stories, but behind those are lessons for your day to day life, or even grander things. You can
Mm.
quite clearly go back in time and see where things have gone wrong.
Mm.
And it's the old saying, those that don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's a huge thing that you can see through the medieval period, and before that, and after that as well.
Yeah, and you're kind of touching on something that I've heard a lot. So there is a famous kind of, I guess, hedge fund founder. His name is Ray Dalio, and he talks about how important it is to study history, and because he said it's all cyclical. And so, if you mentioned, you can look back in time and kind of see where things went wrong, and then how things, kind of self-corrected over a longer span of time. So, if you think about the present day, where would you say we are in that cycle?
That is a really really good question. Oh, that is a good question. I mean, to be cynical, I
Mm.
would probably say we're in that early end times. That sounds really really bad, but I'll kind of
Yeah.
try and justify what I'm saying. So many people have or may not have heard of the Dark Ages, which is this period of immense kind of societal collapse after the Roman
Mm.
Empire kind of fell in the West in the 5th century. It's a bit of an outdated term. I don't personally like to use it for multiple different reasons, but
Hmm.
there are definitely parallels in in the UK, and I'm assuming in the US and around the world as well, of this kind of we can see just about into our very recent past, our parents' generation, of this perceived greatness. It's only over there, but when we
Mm.
look at our own time and just slightly into the future, there's
Mm.
the cracks are starting to show. We had
Mm.
the COVID-19 pandemic. We had, Brexit in the UK. We have all of these things that are like, oh, okay, these are all bad things. And yes, hindsight's 2020, and we can
Of
always
course.
look back and see greatness or see terrible things. But I heard a joke which is quite topical, and it was about the US having parallels to the fall of Rome. And it says the only
Mm.
difference between the fall of Rome and the US is Rome had better roads. I don't know how true that is, but I was thinking, heard the joke, laughed, and was like, oh, actually, yeah. If you think about it, I think there are definitely parallels to that, and that's very, very. It's a very negative way to view it, and I don't think it's all doom and gloom. But I would
Yeah,
also apply that to the fall of Rome, which happened. It definitely happened, but it didn't happen instantly. It happened over
of course.
generations and generations and generations. And another kind of justification for that standpoint I have is one of the markers of this dark age that happened between roughly 500 and 800
Hmm.
AD is the repurposing of buildings. The Romans are famous for colosseums
Mm.
and the Forum and all these amazing things that, you know, if you get the opportunity to visit places like Rome, I fully recommend it. It's amazing. And, you know, these buildings get repurposed into, you know, meeting halls and, you know, things like that. And, you know, that's seen by historians as this terrible, like, perversion of history. And, oh, look how, you know, uncivilized and uncultured people are. But, I mean, you can walk down pretty much any, you know, city street and you'll see an old bank that's a Starbucks. Or you'll see,
Mm.
I don't know, an old church that's got a skate park in it. Or I went to a bar a couple of months ago that was an old church. And it's
Hmm.
like, if you look at that 1,000 years ago, yeah, you can see decline, you can see, you know, a lack of culture, or whatever you want to call it. When realistically, it's just changing fashions and, I guess, passions, and, you know, what's relevant and needed for a society. So
Mm.
yes, I think we're in a period of, I don't want to say decline, but I'll be diplomatic and say a period of considerable change.
That's so interesting because why do you think the repurposing of buildings is one signal that things could be headed for a sort of a downturn?
Another great question. I mean, I think it's human nature to look at things and go, you know, how do we use that? Why are we doing it that way? Why do we do certain things? Is that outdated now? And I think, you know, we've already mentioned like the cyclical nature of history, and I think that's been sped up in our lifetimes. You know, I'm only 30, and yet I feel like I've been through 3 or 4 different generations of change. Whereas, you know, my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, it feels, when you speak to them or when you look back at history, it does seem to be a lot slower. So, but I think it goes back to the point that human beings constantly need to change maybe it's based on purpose. I'm not quite sure, but I think it's changing in values and kind of perceived importance of certain things. You know, let's use the bank and the coffee shop kind of metaphor. You know, going to a bank 20 years ago was a necessary part of your week. You know, you have to, you know, go claim you cash your check from work, or, you know, go get some money out to, you know, do your weekly shop or whatever. Now you have an iPhone, you have your online banking apps. There's no need for that physical building. So, you know, companies who have access to this are going to go, cool, okay, this is something for people to walk past. This is something for people to look at and go, oh, that's a cool building. Caramel latte, please. You know, it's like they've taken something that has maybe lost its purpose and tried to kind of steal a little bit of that purpose. But I don't see it as a bad thing. I think some people see it as a bad thing, and I think if these places and buildings, objects, whatever it is, are treated with the correct level of kind of respect, then it's, you know, more power to you, because, you know, you see it for millennia. It's happened. It will continue to happen. And yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what's going on.
That's fascinating. Kind of this idea of, this is perhaps dying, and how can we kind of breathe new life into it,
Yeah.
with kind of giving it some sort of, new utility. And it's interesting that you mentioned you were looking at some, articles or content where it kind of talked about, the US's parallel to the fall of Rome. Have you seen kind of I guess, the meme that has kind of gone viral lately, which is how many times in a day or week that men think about the Roman Empire?
Yes. Yeah. I have seen it, and it's good. I really liked it when I first saw it. I'm like, yes, history's in the mainstream. Awesome. We're doing well. But yeah, I think
So yeah, why do you think that men think about the Roman Empire so much? It
I mean, it's cool, isn't it? I mean,
is.
there's no getting away from the fact that the Roman Empire is just cool.
Yes.
But I guess on a serious note,
Mm,
I listened to an interview with another phenomenal historian, Mary Beard, a historian of the Roman period, and she
mm.
said, you know, it's great, keeps me in a job, awesome, keep it up, kind of thing. But also, it's like there's a level of masculinity that attaches itself to things like Rome, and it's kind of
Mm.
this safe space for, you know, this kind of macho idea, which isn't
Yes.
necessarily a terrible thing, but there are definitely. connotations that, you know, kind of taint the message slightly. So yes, it's cool, but also, you know, are we attaching certain masculine traits to something that we necessarily don't fully understand? Like, but yeah, I mean, it's cool, isn't it? Like, I grew up
It is.
playing, you know, the Total War games. Rome Total War was one of the first games I sat and really played. I mean, really played.
Mm.
Still play it to this day, and you know, see the red uniforms, and you know, it's just yeah, Rome's cool.
Yeah, Rome is incredible. And yeah, I think you touched on something interesting, which is, big in pop culture right now, which is, masculinity. And so if we think about
Mm.
the Roman Empire, there were some, incredible virtues as it relate to that. So what masculine virtues do you feel like the Roman Empire demonstrated well?
Again, another good question. I mean, it's it's a good question. It's a tough question because you know what is masculinity? What is it now? What is it 2,000 years ago? I think the Roman Empire and the late Republic. Again, it's not my absolute period of choice. I love learning about it, but it's not my speciality. But I would say that, and the interesting thing about Rome is, and the cool thing about Rome is, it's so relevant today. You know, we're speaking English, which has so many Latin loan
Yes.
words. You know, we
Yes.
have running water and roads, and everything's built with Roman arches. It's everywhere. So I guess, to slightly warp your question, I think it gives us
Mm.
incredible lessons in general for, you know, both and all genders. I think it instills a sense of like duty to maybe yourself and to something bigger if you want to, but
Mm.
I think it also gives us a bedrock as a society. Whether we view current societal norms as good or bad, I think the Romans building on the Greeks gave us this democratic, in very large quotation marks, because it's, you know, it's always up for debate, democracy.
Yeah.
It gives us this bedrock to really build on, and you know, you see that pushed through in different forms through the medieval period. It's a kind of a common misconception in the medieval period that it was kings and queens, knights and bishops, peasants. Like, yes, that is true, but also there were
Mm.
periods, especially in England, there's periods of real change, and it always just goes back to Rome. Everything goes back to Rome. So I think it's weird because there's been, you know, millennia of civilization across the world, and yet the one eternal is Rome. And obviously, the,
Mm.
you know, like we've already said, the common trope, the current kind of meme is, you know, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? It's like we all do all the time.
Yeah.
You know, you wear, you know, everything's Rome, everything, whether we want it to be or not.
Yeah, completely agree. And to your point, for history to kind of resurface into the mainstream, I think it's awesome. And, what better way to do that than, memes to bring it in. And then from there, it sparks people's interest. And then that's where people kind of dive in and do their own research. And so I think it's so fascinating. So, whether you look back at the medieval period or the Roman period or, any of the periods that you've looked at, Chris, what are mistakes that worry you that we're going to repeat in kind of current time?
Big question again. You come with the big questions, don't you? I mean, I think the ultimate lesson is, and we've already kind of both mentioned this, it's not learning from history generally.
Mm.
You don't have to look far back into history to see, you know, mistakes are made, and you know, we are repeating them. I think that there are so many things, and you can see it, and I don't want to get too political because it's very easy for, you know, to end up that way. But you see, everybody knows Nazi Germany. Everybody knows what happens during the Second World War.
Yes.
The vast majority of conscientious people will agree that that is a terrible thing that should never be repeated. I would say that
Agreed.
is a historical fact, and
Agreed.
I'm not going to leave anybody any room to disprove that.
Agreed.
But what we can see is a move to the right again. And I don't
Mm.
mean left and right, center, left and right. But there is movements around the world. This isn't a UK problem. This isn't a US problem. This is a global issue
Mm,
where similar messages are being pushed in different ways, very different ways, but there are echoes of a period that's within, living memory for many people. This isn't
mm.
medieval England. We're not talking about Magna Carta. We're talking about the 1940s, which is, I'm terrible at maths, 80 years ago. It's either history or maths I've found in the world. You're either good at maths or history. But yeah, we're looking back and we're ignoring a period of history that should never be forgotten.
Mm,
Again, I don't want to dwell on negativity too much, but
of
that's
course.
an example of where all we have to do is look back, and it's kind of like check yourself before you potentially wreck everything. Never mind just yourself. But yeah, there are messages and lessons throughout history where we have to learn from them. And I think, as you mentioned previously, learning history I think is super important as well, because it's a bedrock, it's a foundation subject that teaches you right from wrong, because you can read objectively, you know, King John King John did this, this was wrong, King John did this was right, this led to this situation. Okay, cool. I can see parallels with X, Y, and Z. The chances are this is going to happen. Lo and behold, it happens. So,
Yeah.
I think it just gives you a good base understanding of human nature and the essentially randomness of it.
And I love that, your favorite period is the medieval times. And, kind of you mentioned a sub branch of that is the Dark Ages, because I recently gave a speech at this communications club I'm in where I touched on the topic a little bit of Asadi. Does that ring a bell?
No?
Acedia. So, Asadi is a condition written by authors like Chaucer and Dante, and it's kind of like this listlessness. And from what I've read, Asadi was seen as deadly for an individual and fatalistic for society. Back in the Middle Ages or Dark Times, and this kind of idea of Asadi is anytime someone lacked kind of direction or meaning or didn't have momentum in their life, that was seen as something very dangerous for a society or individual. And it's interesting that you say that there's this shift kind of politically towards the right a little bit. And what do you think is kind of fueling that shift?
Again, another big question, another good question. I think when I look, when I objectively look at the world, as I guess you do on your way to work, I
Of
think
course.
we've never lived in a place in time where we've had so much access to so much information. I mean,
Agreed.
right behind me now, there's a bookshelf. There's maybe 40 books on it total, if that.
Yeah.
Up until 40 years ago, that was probably the most information a household would have. Yes, you've got
Mm,
access to a library or anything like that, but I mean, I'm talking to you now on a computer. I've got a phone next to me. There's a PS5 over there with access to the internet. Like, we have so much access to information, and I think
mm,
it's it's a obviously it's a benefit. Things like this wouldn't happen without it. I'm
yeah.
very grateful for the technology that allows me to do what I do.
Yep.
I have so much fun doing it, and hopefully bring some entertainment and enjoyment to people as well. But with that comes access to misinformation or
Mm,
misinterpreted information, and I think it's very, very easy to spread a message.
yeah. Especially
Positive.
today in social media.
Yeah, yeah. Like, we met through social media. I met many people through social media, and at its heart, I think it's a wonderful thing that allows people to connect around the world, globally. It's great, but there's always a but, isn't there? It also allows for misinformation. Whether that misinformation is factually incorrect, it's kind of by the by. It doesn't really matter. It's just how a message is spread. And I think having access to so many versions of a message,
Mm,
it's pulling people apart. It takes a lot. and it's almost, I would say, impossible to avoid everything is politics, everything is news, everything is, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. It's all
Yeah.
everywhere, and as a fan of the NFL, it's tough to just see Taylor Swift everywhere. But I digress. It is everywhere, and you cannot escape it. And I think it's giving people not too much information. That sounds like I want to gatekeep information, not at all. But it's almost, well, it's open source, isn't it? The world is now open source, and up until
Mm.
very recently, it wasn't. So you kind of lived in your own bubble. And when it's good, that's great. But when it's bad, it's also terrible. But now everyone's in this giant bubble that is inescapable.
Yeah, and I've thought about this, pretty deeply, and I would love to, kind of share my perspective. And I don't mind, getting political on the podcast, but obviously, only share what you feel comfortable with. When it comes to the amount of information that there is online, there's kind of two schools of thought. One school is, we need to kind of police certain information because misinformation can have, negative effects on society and on people very directly. And then the other school of thought is, we need to let it all out there and let people decide for themselves. Because if we are to be the arbiters of truth, that can get very slippery. And so I think, obviously some sort of solution is somewhere down the middle, but, finding that balance, I think is so challenging. And so, what do you think, as it relates to kind of those tools, two schools of thought and, the approach towards it?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to my last example of Nazi Germany. I think
Mm.
people don't necessarily see Nazi Germany and censorship as things that go hand in hand, but a core principle of Nazi Germany was the censorship of the media through targeted propaganda,
Mm.
and also the burning of the books that we should all have learned at school.
Yeah.
Banning books and burning books has the same end. It's just one is very aggressive, one is more passive aggressive.
Mm.
So I think information should be free, but I agree. I think there should be a point in the middle where reasonable logic is applied to information. But yeah, I think because in a way, like, say you politically sit right down the middle, and you think, okay, everything on the left is bad, everything on the right is bad.
Hmm.
You ban those two groups, you're left with just the middle, which is great for
Yeah.
you. But if slightly left leaning, slightly right leaning, whatever it is, you're then going to feel like the system is then out to get you, which then
Mm.
creates the very problem you're essentially trying to avoid. So, yeah, I mean, the more information, I think anyway, the more information you absorb, the better it makes you as a person, the more rounded it makes you. And a core principle for me is I will try never to pass judgment on somebody's viewpoint of something without looking into that viewpoint, whether it's politics or whatever it is.
Mm.
A feeling about a historical person. Winston Churchill in the UK is a polarizing character. I sit very much in the middle. I don't really have an opinion, whatever, but there are two very, very different camps from very different sides of a political coin. And I think it's really interesting when you listen to both those arguments. And I think that then allows you as a historian, as a person that, views society, whether it's today or yesterday, and it allows you to, hopefully come to a rounded solution or rounded conclusion, sorry. And that's how I try and view information.
Mm. One thing you mentioned was the ability to take in another side's perspective and then use that to kind of formulate your own opinion, even though, you don't necessarily agree or disagree. I feel like that ability to have that type of dialogue is something that is lost today. Why do you think that is?
I agree. I think it goes back to the access to information.
Mm.
Anyone can go on the internet and Google. Essentially, you can Google the answer to your own question and find that
Yes.
you've been justified. I could say the shirt I'm wearing is green. You will tell me, no, Chris, it's clearly blue. I could Google what color is Chris's shirt. It will say green somewhere in the internet.
Yeah.
And then I can go, nope, here's my source. source A, B, C, shit, there it is, it's green. You know, that's the essentially the world that we live in now, where it's all out there, and there's kind of
Yes.
no escaping it. But that's why I have 15 different books basically on the same topic, because you can read one book about medieval England and that's it. That's your entire understanding of a period, of a group of people, of a time in society. And it could tell you that it was, I don't know, it was all, everyone had the plague constantly, everyone was dying in wars constantly, the kings were dripped in gold and all this stuff. And you can take that as a snapshot and go, cool, everything I know about medieval England is based on that one sentence. Or you can read three more books and you'll hear that it wasn't always that plague ridden. There wasn't always war. The kings were dripped in gold, but not always. And there was this guy that wasn't. And then there was this war that actually, it's about adding context. I try
Mm.
not to be, narrow minded, and I try not to be kind of direct with my, whether it's learning for university or for my own work or pleasure. I try not to, do one thing and then move on. I try and build on something I already know, or start something. I am reading about Rome probably because of the meme, but I've read a few books about Rome like recently, and they've given me different perspectives on the same time period, the same people.
Yeah.
Augustus always comes up, Julius Caesar always comes up, but you get a different perspective. And honestly, I think it just makes you enjoy it more.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about that is, you get to digest different people's opinions and perspectives, on what they've learned about Rome, and then use that to kind of formulate your own unique perspective to then go
Yeah.
write your own book, Chris, which would be awesome. So, you mentioned, you're currently, reading a few books about Rome. What stories or what have you learned, kind of from that study that really stood out to you?
I mean, back to my previous point, I've learned that Rome is very cool. And it just seems to be cool thing after cool thing after cool thing that happens. But I think the thing that I didn't expect to learn that I've learned, and
Hmm.
you just learn this through history studying anyway, is we are ultimately the same people we've always been.
Oh, I love it. Okay.
Everybody wants to be rich and powerful, but nobody wants to admit it.
Mm.
Everybody wants to look cool, but well, maybe a lot of people more admit that one. But ultimately, that's what it boils down to. Everybody wants to be successful and safe,
Mm.
and that's a huge part of any period in history is you see these stories of people grasping at power. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and you see it today. It's never changed, and I doubt it will ever change, unless there's a serious like cerebral shift in our brains that mean we don't care about that kind of stuff anymore. But you know everything. I'm thinking of examples in my head from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar to Charlemagne to Richard the Lionheart. It's the same character in
Mm.
just slightly different ways. And I'm not boiling those four blokes down to one person, but you see the same goals, the same motivations, just veiled in different deities, in different
Mm.
worldviews. But ultimately, we always end up at the same point.
So I have another heavy hitting question for you because, with what you just said, basically it sounds like throughout your study in history, there have been fundamental things that have stayed consistent. And I could even call some of those, fundamental truths.
Hmm.
And so, what are your perspective on the fundamental truths of society or history or, people in general?
Good question. I think realistically, viewing history long view,
Hmm.
I would like to say that a real true core truth of an average person is like if you say something, mean it, or if you
Mm.
plan to do something, do it. Don't change, but also be prepared to change if that's the right thing to do, and kind of back up that reason.
Hmm.
Essentially, honesty. I would say honesty is something that
Mm.
Brutally hasn't got many people far, but I think I would rather be on that side of history than the opposite, even if that meant, a lesser place in it. Like, I'm very aware of my place in history.
Mm.
I will not be written about, but that's fine. That's not my role. But if I can, get to the end, and I'm asked by whoever or whatever, how do you think you did? Like, yeah, I told the truth. I was honest. I was fair, and I
Mm.
did what I did with conviction. Whether that's I'm going to mow the lawn, I'm going to mow the lawn. If I'm not, I'm going to change that decision. It's based on a good reason that kind of justifies it. So yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely massive question, but yeah, I mean, history is written by the victors, isn't it? So I guess those truths have been decided. Whether they are the truths is up for serious debate. But yeah, I think honesty, integrity, and fairness are key truths that I would probably say are worth applying to history. Whether you see that in the great men of history, that horrible term that is unfortunately still pretty much used, that the history is the study of great men. I fundamentally disagree that that should be the case, and hopefully one day it isn't. But those don't always apply to great men in quotation marks. So, but yeah, that's what I would like to say is the case.
So you said history, fairness, and what was the third thing?
Honesty, integrity, and fairness.
Honesty, integrity, and fairness. Those are some beautiful truths to live by, Chris. So, one thing you mentioned is keeping your word, about situations. If you say you're going to do something, you should do it.
Hmm.
Why is it so important to you? Or do you think why is it so important in general for people to live that as their truth?
I think you can go through life on your own and do pretty well. I think you
Mm.
can you can get by fairly well, but at some point you need to rely on someone. Whether that's day one, you can't speak, talk, you can't walk, you can't eat. You rely on your parents, don't you? So I think having that kind of trust in other people, I think it allows you to be a better person. And I would never want someone to feel about me, I can't necessarily trust what Chris is going to say or do. So I try and make sure that that's never the case, because I need other people. I rely heavily, on my girlfriend, my colleagues, my friends to help me. Whether it's, I don't know, someone gives me a lift to work or holds the door open. I need to know that kind of that universal trust that whether it's a door being held open or something far more important, I can trust that the person in front of me is going to do that. So I think without that, it just breeds selfishness, which is something that you see periodically through history, almost continuously, and it just leads to breakdown. So without that trust that, I guess, somebody else is going to do something for you, you have to have that within yourself as well to in a way know that you're going to do something for somebody else.
Mm.
But then it gets back to my other point about honesty, is if you can't, that's also fine. Just be honest about it, because the one thing that disappoints people is dishonesty. The
Mm.
whole "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." I think that's really true. Whether it's your parents, your friends, your partner, your colleague, your boss, whatever it is, if they if they can't trust that you're a reliable person, then you kind of don't have. This can sound awful, but you have a diminished value to them, and I don't think that's something that's. I think that's super avoidable. I think just by being honest and being true to your words, I think you can maintain healthy relationships, and with yourself as well. You know,
Mm.
I find myself getting very disappointed with myself if I don't do something I've said I'm going to do. That's a personal battle for me, and I think it's very easy to project onto other people. Obviously, we all project whatever it is, but yeah. So kind of be honest with yourself first, but be honest with everybody else as well.
What's beautiful about honesty is regardless of where you're brought into this life, that's something that everyone can have a strong conviction about.
Mm,
Not what one person doesn't have the ability, more than the other, to live their life more honestly. We're all kind of put on the same playing field or the level playing field with that. And that's why I think that's so fascinating. You know, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of, kind of this part of the conversation was, the fundamental truths that you've learned from studying, Roman history and how those have carried throughout time. And so now, kind of backtracking to what your main interest is, which is, kind of the medieval era. Why does that era fascinate you so much?
it's a good question, and I don't really know.
Mm,
It's not like a conscious decision that I don't think
yes,
anybody makes a conscious decision as to why do you support a certain sports team or whatever it is. Excuse me.
agreed.
But I mean, as far back as I can remember, going all the way back to being a kid, you know, castles and knights and things like that has always been a huge part of my interest.
Mm,
Whether it's the first time I watched the film A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, I saw this film and I was like, this is the coolest film I've ever seen. I still watch it almost monthly at this point in my life. It's still, it's like a core memory for me. And it's just, again, it's like how people view Rome. I just think it's the coolest period of history. You've just got the most ridiculous things happening constantly. Like there's people just doing every single possible thing you could think of, and it's just normal. It just happens, and and to get more kind of from a more of a kind of a academic point of view, there's just immense change. There's 1,000 years of change,
mm,
and on the face of it, it doesn't look like that. And I think that's what's so interesting about it is you look at, I don't know, periods like the long 19th century, as historians call the 1800s the long 19th century, because of it seemed to last forever. You start with the Napoleonic era and you end, virtually with First World War. So that's in a 100-year period.
mm,
The Middle Ages or the medieval period is the same. You start with this weird post-Roman broken world, and then you kind of end a few centuries later, with Christopher Columbus has done what he's done in the Americas, and the whole worldview has shifted once again. And you can look at it as this person did this at that point, this battle was in this field in France, and so died, and very, very
mm.
boring, very granular. But also you can look behind it and see some really human kind of moments. Something I spoke about on another podcast recently was it's kind of a favorite anecdote of mine. So we're in the early 12th century at this point. Maybe not even that actually. Sorry, late 11th century. So Vikings are still roaming around parts of the world, and there's three brothers. There's a William, a Henry, and a Robert, and
Mm,
William and Henry are the younger two, and they see their older brother Robert sat downstairs, and they tip a chamber pot over his head. It's probably really funny. It's probably as funny as it would be today, but that caused a rebellion against their father. Robert rebelled against his father. His dad was William the Conqueror of all dads, so it was pretty bad to be Robert. But human moments like that, you hear Battle of Hastings, 1066. You hear those big name Magna Carta, things like that. But hidden around that are real bits of human history, and that's what's cool. That's not a medieval thing. That is just history in general. But I yeah, tipping of the chamber pot is always a famous favorite anecdote of mine.
I love that story because it's like brothers being brothers,
Exactly.
and and so when you mentioned there's just so many ridiculous things that happened during that time that blow your mind. What's top of mind for you in terms of an example?
I mean, off the top of my head, the Crusades. The Crusades are
Mm,
it's something that I'm fascinated by as a topic, but just the thought of what that is just insane to me.
Mm.
I understand, not understand that. I'm not justifying it, but I can get in the head of a religious fundamentalist on either side of an argument, and I can get it. But the fact that you would mobilize essentially millions of people over a period of what, 400 years, really, 500 years, maybe. You can
Mm.
mobilize people over that period of time with a specific goal in mind. It works sometimes, it doesn't work, but that frames relationships around the world today.
Oh,
Places like
interesting.
Spain, you go to Spain or you look at many Spanish towns and cities, you'll see Arabic influences everywhere. Places like
Mm.
Alhambra in Spain. Alhambra is not a Spanish word. That is 100% an Arabic word. It
Interesting.
it's and that's part of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain by Christian forces, which lasted about 800 years. And the fact that it lasted for that long, to me, I don't know about anybody else, but I struggle to conceptualize almost 1,000 years of something like that. So yeah, that's a massive example, I guess, because it's such a wide ranging example. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Balkan states, and obviously the Near East. But yeah, it's just something like the Crusades as a I guess a historical object to me is just mind blowing.
Yeah, I completely. And I remember, studying the Crusades, when I was in high school. And then I think like being like a prepubescent, teenage boy, it was just like the most badass thing,
Yeah,
ever to study.
absolutely.
So that definitely brings back a lot of memories. There's this term I would say that is popular in social media, and I've saw you post a little bit about it. So, what can we learn from memento mori, and what does it mean?
Oh, I love memento mori. I think, and good research on my Instagram. Memento mori essentially means in Latin, remember you must die, or remember you
Mm,
will die. And it's basically our version of there's two guarantees in life, death and taxes.
mm,
It's exactly the same phrase. It's just said in a nicer language. And I think you can view memento mori as, again, a very negative thing. You know, do I have to remember that ultimately the end of this is death?
mm,
Or you can view it as the only guarantee in life is death. So between being born and passing away, the rest is kind of up to you. So
mm,
it's something that's, I guess I don't think about it every day, but it crops up every now and again, and I see it as a real moment of kind of inner peace. That yeah, I am one day gonna stop, for lack of a better word. Me as a historian, as a person, as a whatever, I'm just gonna stop. But before that, whether it's tomorrow or in 100 years or whatever, I really don't think I'll get to 130. But however short or long that period is, I may as well enjoy it and
mm,
do something with it. So yeah, I think it's on the face of it, I think it's quite negative. But I think there's some beautiful examples of medieval jewelry, usually rings with a little skull on it, and it just says "Memento Mori." Usually, like
yep.
inside the ring and things like that, and they're the most goth jewelry there is, and I think they're awesome. But yeah, I think, and I don't believe that it would have been considered negative at the time either. I don't
Mm,
think in a world so heavily kind of a very heavily religious world, I don't think that level of kind of self determination would have been allowed. So for me, looking back on it, it must have been seen as a positive, and I think that's something that we should hold to this day. I think we should look at it and go, yeah, I am going to die one day, but not right now. So what am I going to do right now, this week, this year, whatever it is, to just have fun with it. You know, there's no guarantees. Well, there's one guarantee, and that is unfortunately death, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes, I completely agree. I think memento mori and reflecting on your mortality is one of the best ways to really do an audit of your life.
Yeah,
And am I doing the things that I want to do with this guarantee waiting for me at the end of the road? Do I want to get there and have look back and have regrets about how that time was spent? Or do I want to look back and kind of, be proud of how I spent my time?
yeah,
It's interesting. One thing you mentioned was why you like the Middle Ages. And, for you, you kind of boil it down to, sometimes we're called towards certain things and we can't really explain it. I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peterson, and he has a kind of a beautiful, kind of quote about that. I'm going to butcher it, but he talks about how there are so many things that we can choose in life, but the one thing that we can't are our interests.
yeah,
And, this ability to move towards what beckons us, I think is so beautiful. And I think, memento mori kind of gets me in the frame of mind to think about, okay, like this is what's beckoning me. And let me just, live that out and see what happens.
yeah. I agree, and I think I've always tried to I've always tried to be, and I mentioned this earlier about like being kind of true to myself and who I
Hmm.
am, and I've always felt very comfortable with who I am
Yeah.
as a person, as a kind of young man, as growing up as a teenager. I knew exactly who I was. Didn't always
Mm.
get it right, in
Yeah.
kind of the way I presented myself, but down to my core, I always knew who I was. And
Mm.
history isn't a cool subject to the vast majority of people. A lot of people see it as it's stuffy, it's highbrow, it's boring, it's for old people.
Hmm.
And I've never once let that change how I view it. I've
Oh,
loved history
beautiful.
since I was a kid. I used to get just at school, kids just targeted me based on a topic. That was it.
Mm.
And obviously it bothered me, but also I
Of
was like,
course.
is this the only thing that you've got? Literally just grow up, because in 30 years, you'll be watching a documentary going, oh yeah, Chris was right. This is actually really cool and interesting. But yeah, I think, you know, interests are, they're really core to who you are as a person. And
Agreed.
yeah, it's a great quote, because on the face of it, it seems like you pick these things. Like, I'm a New England Patriots fan. I didn't pick that. I kind of did, but you know what I mean? It's just, I happened,
Yes.
by Madden, what's the first team? Sweet. Patriots, Tom Brady. Okay, let's go. Cool. 15 years later, still a Patriots fan. You know, it just happened. What kind of music you like, even down to, what kind of decor you've got in your house. They aren't really choices. It's kind of like you're going to end up there at some point, whether you ironically like it or not. But yeah, it's a cool way to look at interests, that they're not actually choices, that you're going to get there at some point.
Completely agree. And, the experience you touched on with, people picking on you for your interests in grade school, what
Mm,
I have found is usually those people peaked in high school or
yeah.
primary school. So another a universal truth, it seems, because I was definitely picked on for some things when I was younger as well.
Mm,
I do think, one thing you touched on that was beautiful was the conviction to move towards what you were interested in, regardless of how people viewed it or perceived you. I would say, and this is me included, when we're younger, we can struggle with that because, we want to, kind of move with the crowd.
yeah.
Where did that ability from you come from?
I don't know. I think I've always felt it. As
Mm,
silly as that sounds, and it sounds so cliche, I think, I'm very, very grateful for the lessons I was kind of taught by my granddad. He's a
mm,
great kind of hero of mine. He's, hard nosed businessman, head of the family kind of guy, but he could, talk the birds out of the trees. He could talk to anyone, and it's
mm,
it's 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 something that he instilled in me, and it's why I like doing podcasts. I like doing public speaking. I like speaking about anything to anyone.
Mm.
And I think another thing that that gave me by in kind of as a secondary is just confidence, and in knowing that whatever I'm doing or whatever I'm into or reading about, whatever it is, it's like this is for me and me alone, and I don't have to justify it to anyone. And I think as a society, we feel quite often that we have to justify everything that we do. We have to justify why we
Mm.
like certain things, why we don't like certain things. I don't like mushrooms. I'm never going to tell you why I don't like mushrooms because it's not important. I don't like mushrooms. That's fine. That's it. Done. You can look at a very small example of something like that, or you can take it to something much bigger. But yeah, I think I've always been taught that confidence is king, and you can talk your way out of anything. And those two things I've always tried to hold quite close to me. I truly am
Mm.
a master of nothing. I'm a jack of all trades, like to the letter. But my ability to talk out of them, it saved me multiple times.
Who are some of the most confident men in history?
Good question. So that's a difficult question because it's like, how are we being told that they're confident?
Mm.
We probably miss out 99.9% of every human that's ever existed. We will never know who they are. We will never ever learn, you know, what their favorite color was, what they had for dinner the night before. We'll never ever learn that.
Mm.
But I mean, the typical one that we go to, the two, and they're both topical, is Julius Caesar and Napoleon.
Mm.
Two very similar people. Napoleon was a fan of Julius Caesar for multiple clear and obvious reasons, but you know, those are two people that come to mind very, very, very clearly for me. But someone that I study personally and find really interesting and implore people to look into is Henry II of England. Henry II of England is a kind of minor nobleman that ends up, king of England and ruling lands from Scotland to Spain, and he does it off his own back with
Mm.
considerable help from his wonderful wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is my you know kind of history fascination. But he's a person that I guess outside of my sphere people don't tend to know. Everyone knows Henry VIII, but few people know the guys before. But he's someone that I view as he used what he had to get to where he needed to get, and never made any apologies for that, and used situations and people and abilities and things like that to get where he got. And I think you can see that with Napoleon, you see that with Julius Caesar, you see that with Alexander the Great, you can see that with Matilda, the empress, that the Holy Roman Empress that should have been Queen of England. That there are so many people in history that just ooze confidence, and I think you see it by the ones that get results, and they get results on their own, not based on. Yes, it's based on who they are and it's based on who their dad was, but also it's like, okay, take the situation and mold it into something else. And I think Napoleon is probably the best example of that. Came from a minor noble family in Corsica, went to school at the perfect time in the perfect place, was never really good as a soldier. He wasn't a great soldier, but managed to find a niche, and he exploited the hell out of that niche to become emperor of most of Europe, self-crowned emperor. That's a title that realistically only one guy in the whole of human history has. That's pretty confident for a little guy, which I appreciate as someone that's only 5'6". So yeah, he's yeah. I'd probably say Napoleon in short to your question.
Mm. And we love a short king, Chris. And so
We
I'm glad
truly
to
do.
know. I'm glad to know Napoleon was one of the most famous ones in history. You know, as we wrap up, Chris, I think one theme that we talked about in the beginning of the call was you know looking at lessons of history and then comparing that to where we are now. We're headed towards a certain course, in whether someone can say what that course is with 100% confidence, that is impossible.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have in your perception of the course that we're in to help divert us away from where we're going? What
Read
can
your
we do?
history.
Mm,
Read your history and just learn. Read, learn, and I guess trust that everyone else is going to do the same. You
mm,
know, it's very easy for me to sit here and go, oh well, we're going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Sit here in my very safe living room in a very safe place with nothing really going on. It's really easy for me to do that, but we kind of need everybody to do that. Learn from learn the great things that have happened in human history. The discovery of the germ theory in the 19th century. That's
mm.
the zenith of human potential. The space age. We can argue all day whether we went to the moon or not. I do believe we went to the moon, just for anybody concerned. Those are the great moments in human history, but also, look at things like, let's look at slavery. Let's look at
Mm,
the Black Death and the Great Plague of the 17th century. Let's look at where things went really wrong. And, one of the first things, actually, the first thing I ever wrote for somebody else in terms of history was I compared the Black Death of the 14th century to COVID-19. It was in the middle of
mm.
2020. It was very, very fresh and very new to everyone. And I was writing it basically with this question in mind, like, what can we learn looking, hundreds of years back into history, and what we're still doing very much a lot of the same stuff. Isolation is not a new thing. Um, even some of the treatments weren't that far, or some of the kind of folk medical kind of treatments were very similar, but also how far we've come. So yeah, I would say learn your history, and hopefully if we all do that, we won't make the same mistakes. We'll make new mistakes, don't get me
Yes.
wrong, but those ones are fine. Not fine, but expected.
Yes.
But yeah, that's what I would say.
Beautifully said, Chris. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was good. I really appreciate it.